Hello, hello. Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight, both in person here, grab a seat anywhere. Here in the front, there's some space, and via live stream tonight. I'm Brett Solomon, Director of Public Programming and Events here at MacDowell. We are America's oldest arts residency program with 450 acres and 31 artist studios in Peterborough, New Hampshire, located on the traditional homelands of the Western Abenaki people, and our gallery space here in New York City is located on Lenape land. At MacDowell, we believe that art can be a powerful tool for imagination leading towards transformation, and we are committed to providing space for such work to be created. At our residency in Peterborough, artists stay for 2 to 8 weeks and are provided time, space, 3 chef-prepared meals a day, and a community of multidisciplinary peers to work with: visual artists, filmmakers, choreographers, playwrights, composers, architects, journalists, photographers, and more. We also present annual awards and public programs like this one around topics affecting our artist communities. This talk is the 3rd event in a series created in partnership with the Luce Foundation, and we're just really excited to be here tonight with all of you. Tonight, we are honored to present 3 leading voices in a conversation moderated by interim president of the Luce Foundation, Sean Buffington. They will explore the impact of archives and photography on public memory, interrogate the limitations and importance safeguarding the documentary record, among many other topics. After the conversation, there's going to be a brief Q&A. There's some paper and pens on your seats to fill out, and someone on staff will collect them. And if you are online, please email events@macdowell.org. There will also be some time for those of you in person to come on downstairs for a brief reception. And so to moderate this talk and get us started, I'd like to introduce you to Interim President of the Henry Luce Foundation, Sean Buffington.
Is that on? Yep, great. Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to see you all here. And it is my great pleasure to welcome our 3 outstanding panelists today. We'll see what order they enter in, but I'll just start calling their names. We have Nam Kim. Nam is an archaeologist and a professor at the University of Wisconsin. Kristen Lubben, who is the executive director of the Magnum Foundation. And finally, Accra Shepp, who is a photographer and also teaches at the School of the Visual Arts here in New York City, and is also, I believe, a MacDowell alum. Yes. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes, please welcome them. So we're going to get to their work in just a moment, but I thought we would start with a general question that I will put to them as a group and ask for their insights on it. Brett, as he was introducing the session, referred to this phrase, public memory. And we talk about archives and photography playing this role in shaping public memory. But that phrase, public memory, seems to me to be maybe more slippery than ever before. It seems to imply that there is a kind of generally shared version of history, or that that's something that we aspire to. Now, I don't know if that's ever been true, that there's been a shared version of history, or even that we've aspired to it, but it does seem to me that that consensus is more broken now than ever before into smaller and smaller fragments, at least in my lifetime. So what do we mean by public memory from your perspective as artists, scholars, and curators? What is public memory, and what does it mean to try to shape it? And why don't I'll start with Nam, maybe.
Thank you, Sean. Let me just first say thank you for being here, and it's an honor for me to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. This idea of shared memory and public memory, at least for me as an archaeologist, is an important one to contemplate about how the past is not only documented, but also interpreted and shaped and then disseminated and shared. So the idea of a kind of public memory, I think, is in some ways it's tied to viewpoints, and some viewpoints that might be more dominant than others. And the idea then of how the past, whether you're talking about archaeological materials, artifacts, landscapes, or how they might be exhibited in publications or in museums or elsewhere, they are subject to political viewpoints. And so this idea of public memory, I think, is very important when we think about reframing histories and offering new kinds of lenses to interpret, to bring more viewpoints to the table, and to represent a wider array of voices. In my own work, I can think about how there are dominant narratives nationally with different kinds of archaeological records, and how oftentimes it's the dominant meta-narrative that the national government or entities might be promoting about the kinds of materials that we have at our disposal. And there are choices that are being made then when we think about memory. What is remembered, what is commemorated, there is the process of forgetting as well. So there are certain perspectives that are not included in that dominant perspective or that dominant narrative. So that's kind of how I would land from an archaeological standpoint, at least.
Kristen, is it too soon to? Kristen warned me not to start with her.
We had a, I don't know if this is on. Can you hear me? No?
I think you just need to press the button up.
Oh, up. Better. Sean's joking because I was saying that I was flummoxed by the notion of public memory, especially now, as you say. I mean, it's, I think it's a term that, could be questioned at any moment, but particularly now, I think, it raises all these questions about, what public are we speaking about, the notion of some collective understanding of history, and, idea of we the people, the notion that there's some collective understanding or project, which, as you say, has always been sort of a fiction, but that is so fractured right now that I think it's so visible that there's not such a thing. I think what our project has been, and we'll speak more about that, but is sort of expanding that picture, right? So that it's not about creating, again, as though there ever was some unified shared notion of public memory or, a consolidated, agreed upon notion of history, but that there is a multiplicity of histories and of publics, and adding to that picture in many ways, including bringing in voices that haven't been traditionally included, but also approaches to history that aren't official histories or aren't academic histories, that there are other ways to enter the notion of preserving, recognizing, acknowledging histories is sort of some of what's on my mind when you ask that question.
Accra.
Hi, thank you, Sean, and thank you all for being here tonight. I love listening to Nam and Kristen talk about this because it's clear that the concept of public memory is something that exists across cultures, exists across time. That is, there is a thing, public memory. But the idea that, well, does it really exist? Is it really a thing? It's like, well, Santa Claus, the concept exists. Is there really a Santa Claus? So it's like we're brought to this situation that if we imagine it to be real, is it real? And of course, as Nam and Kristen have pointed out, it's terribly fraught. And it's a situation where perhaps we aspire, we long for this idea of public memory. And when I was thinking about this question, because we talked a little bit about this before, I was recalling my own childhood in the 60s when there was a great deal of conversation like now, not very polite conversation like now, and I thought discourse is a way of framing this idea perhaps of public memory, because whose memory are we going to be commemorating? Whose memory is going to become official? And for how long will it be official before it's rewritten or defunded? It's an ongoing thing. And I don't know, for me, as I want to circle back around, for me the important thing is that it's something that we want. Whether it really exists as a thing, I think, as you say, it's too difficult.
So I'll stick with you, Accra, on this question, but I'd love to hear from all three of you. So each of you is here in part because your own work involves a project that is about trying to complicate history and complicate memory, trying to bring forward into public view experiences, interpretations, and understandings of history that are maybe at odds with or not included in kind of public memory, if you will, whatever that might mean. So I'd love to just hear each of you talk a little bit about those projects. And Accra, I don't know if you want to talk about, you've done actually quite a lot of these projects, going back to Occupy, documentation of the Occupy movement, all the way through COVID and up to the Gaza protests at Columbia. So I'll let you decide where you want to talk about those.
Well, it's fascinating because if anyone decides that they want to go see something firsthand that's happening here in the city that's in the news, it's really eye-opening because there will be a disconnect between what you see reported in the media and what you see with your own eyes. And that at a certain point, you have to decide, well, is my version valid? In the case of Occupy, excuse me, I was there for nearly a year regularly, so I felt my version was fairly reliable, and it did not map at all onto what I was reading and seeing in the press, which reported that Occupy was a protest of young white privileged men. And I was like, well, what about all the women and people of color and older people that I was photographing? Did they not really exist? And then moving forward to Gaza, it was just endless. There was a level of hysteria in the official press because the conversation, the cultural conversation that we're having now is terribly difficult. Now I'm going to say it, and some people may dislike me for it, but right now the conversation is, do we continue to elide Judaism with Zionism? Zionism is about 100 years old, and Judaism is maybe, 5,000, 6,000 years old, maybe older? So they're quite different things, and the conversation we're having now is actually decoupling the two, and it is traumatically painful. And it led, during the Gaza peace protests, as I refer to them, because it is a peace protest, rather like the Vietnam peace protest of the 60s, because there were children and non-combatants dying in huge numbers, people saying, no, let them die, because, well, I don't think they really thought it through, because why would anyone want children to die? And at the protest, I saw the majority of the people at the Columbia protests were Jewish, standing with their Muslim classmates and colleagues. And there was clear-minded action going on. No one was taking anything for granted. And their punishment for exercising free speech was expulsion and prosecution by the law. And the press saw that as fit and just, by and large.
So I'm going to jump to Nam because Accra just mentioned, is talking about war and anti-war or pro-peace protests. And of course, you started by talking about archaeology, but actually the project that brought you here is, it turns out it will have an archaeological component, but it's very personal and is related very directly to the Vietnam War and its aftermath. I wonder if you can tell us about it.
Sure. So this is a project that I've been working on very recently, and it's a radical departure from my previous work as an archaeologist looking at contexts dating to over 2,000 years ago. This is something more of a contemporary archaeology project, if you will, and it's related to my own personal family history. So I'll share a few of those details just so you have some context. My father is Korean and my mother is Vietnamese, and they both experienced from young ages, in their own respective home countries, displacement as a result of conflict and war. They were forcibly removed from hometowns, separated from family, and so on. As fate would have it, they meet each other in the 1960s in Saigon and undergo displacement once again, this time as a couple with me in tow. I'm a year old at the time when this transpires. So now we are looking at April 29th, 1975. My parents, this was the day before Saigon is taken and is toppled. And they find a way out through various routes. They get to the USA building, and they are able to go from the rooftop of that building as part of what's known as Operation Frequent Wind. We're evacuated out of Saigon into the coast onto various vessels. We end up on the USS Midway aircraft carrier, transferred to the USS Kimbrough, then to refugee camps in the Philippines, and then ultimately in Guam as part of Operation New Life. I've been documenting these stories. I've heard these stories from my parents my entire life, and it's probably no accident that I've been fascinated by this topic of war as a result, and I pursued that professionally. But in the last few years, as I've been documenting these stories, I've been filling in the gaps. And one of those big gaps was this episode related to Operation New Life, what transpires in Guam. This led to research, and this led to networking with folks on the island, just trying to figure out and piece together some of these stories and to fill in these gaps in our family history, but also in what I started to realize was global history. And that led to this project that was generously funded by the Luce Foundation in documenting that experience. In addition to my father's and my mother's experiences and stories that I heard growing up, my father had his camera with him. So he took photographs, and I think some of them might have been going through the screen above. And I think there are a couple of photos in particular that I would point to. There's, Gene, I don't know if you're able to do this, but photo number 3. And that is a photo of my mother and myself off the coast of Vietnam. So he had choices as we were leaving, things that we were commanded to leave things behind, throw stuff onto the rooftop. You can't bring that suitcase. Everything has to be left behind. My mother decided to carry me and some diapers and some water. My father decided to carry his camera. And so he took photos along the way. This is part of the reason I'm here on this panel, and I'm not a photographer. These are photos that I have inherited from my parents, but I can tell how powerful they are. And I'm very privileged to be on this panel to be talking about this from a personal standpoint, because knowing these photographs exist and having access to them shows us what I think is a very powerful way to bring different kinds of agency to these stories and experiences, rather than relying on historical narratives and accounts, other kinds of footage and photographs taken by others, but taking the photos taken by the refugees themselves and looking at through their eyes and their experiences, I think is a very powerful endeavor. It's putting faces to these experiences, giving us agency, and looking at photos not just as documentation, but then the art of photographing as a kind of performative quality. So there are the folks that are taking the pictures, there are the folks that are viewing the pictures, there are the folks that are in this as subjects of the pictures themselves. So that's how this project kind of evolved, and I'm happy to continue talking about that as we move forward.
Kristen, counter histories. The Magnum Foundation, which you can explain to people what that is and what it does, but the project, a particular project that you and I have spent some time on together is Counter Histories. And can you tell us a little bit about what that is, where it came from, and how it relates to this question of kind of shaping public memory and ideas of history?
Yeah, well, it was amazing to see those pictures, and in some ways, those are very much what we're trying to do with Counter Histories, which is an initiative of the Magnum Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization based here in New York that supports photographers, mostly documentary photographers, but sort of trying to expand both the toolkit of what constitutes documentary photography, how to do visual storytelling differently, but also whose stories are told and whose stories are elevated. And as Sean said, it's a project we've been in dialogue about for the past 4 years. And the centerpiece of this initiative is a fellowship that supports photographers, artists who are working with archives or reframing histories. So, not unlike the archive that you're working with, that we're supporting mostly artists and photographers to then be creating their own project out of it. So not academics or historians working with this material, but trying to find new entry points into histories with the idea of, as I mentioned earlier, adding to a notion of what constitutes history, but also trying to look at the relationship between photography and history and what gets remembered, what gets forgotten on purpose, what do archives do? I think there is a tendency to see photography as a straightforward record of truth. I mean, now more under siege with AI, but the relationship as photography as proof is a very deep and old one. But photographic archives have so many gaps, and in so many, any archives are to a certain degree a record of who's keeping the archive and for what purpose. So often they're archives that represent their maker or represent state power, and there are so many gaps and so many absences. So a lot of the people who are part of this Counter Histories project are looking at those gaps, what's been left out. So there's both artists working with archives, as you are, and bringing those forward and trying to fill in gaps in histories or bring in stories from the perspective of those who encountered this history. But then there are also projects where people are doing incredible work to try to imagine histories that weren't photographed, or to fill in some of these gaps or interrogate what those gaps mean. So we're now in our second cohort, again, with the support of the Luce Foundation, for which we're very, very grateful. But I see it in some ways as core to what we do, because it, more than as a topic that we're working on, I feel like it's a new approach to documentary photography too. It's about not only emphasizing or prioritizing the voice of the single maker, though that's important too, but recognizing that one photographer's perspective tells one story, and there's so many other stories, whether those are family histories, state archives, and how those can be read against the grain for what they didn't mean to reveal but do. There's so much here that I feel like it mixes up what we're thinking about when we think about documentary photography and expands it in really interesting ways. So I could go on and on, but I won't.
I'm just going to say,
time.
in response to what you were saying, and actually piggybacking a little bit on Nam's photographs as well, you just said something that like in my head, that you want to have not just one privileged voice, but several. And my personal experience, specifically with photographing at Occupy, was that I desired that multitude of voices. I kept looking for it, but all I found was people making images to support a received narrative that didn't map onto what was actually there. And it was maddening. It's the thing that made me stay, because there didn't seem to be anyone else who cared to look and see what was happening. Much like Nam, your father was in this incredible position to make images to which no one else had the opportunity to make images. It just wasn't available. He was that person.
I'm the one who introduced this whole idea of public memory, shared memory, but I want to flip it now, actually, and ask you about, because each of you, I think, in different ways is working in a way that is extremely personal, or facilitating the very highly personal work of others. And I guess rather than trying to think about crafting a sort of shared narrative, I wonder how you think about your work as creating opportunities for people to put themselves into a narrative of history, to sort of find themselves, to see themselves in history, or to forcibly rip open a spot for themselves in history. I don't know if that resonates at all with any of you.
Yeah, one of the artists we've been working with came to mind. I don't know if we I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's Kiana Mestrich, if that's on the list. I can think of so many examples, but that's the first one that came to mind as somebody whose initial, that's not her, but we can go through them. They're all interesting. But I probably shouldn't look at them or I'm going to get distracted. But I was thinking about Kiana's work, because she came into the program thinking that she was going to do one project about trying to assemble a visual history of Black women in the workforce in the 1960s and 70s based on photographs that she had of her mom. And she did an open call for people to put in submissions, and she didn't find what she was looking for, didn't find as many things as she was hoping to find. And then she started making these amazing collages where she brought together images from Ebony and Jet and from office supply catalogs, and they've turned into these gorgeous, incredible collages that are trying to kind of fill in a gap of what she couldn't find. And I can think of other artists along that line too, but there are also so many that are either using their own family history, or here Marilyn Nance, who I'm sure you know, is revisiting a history that that is worth revisiting and didn't get the attention that should have at the moment. But so many of these stories, I think the invitation of counter histories, and it's part of the reason why we, the first time we did it, we got over 1,100 applications. The second time, it's like 1,500 applications. I think, if we continue doing it, we're going to have to think about a different way to do it. But once the invitation is out there, that this is Kiana's work here. It's just on view of Baxter Street too. Once you start thinking about this, of how can my family history, how can this, state history, how many different kinds of histories, how can they be entered differently? And it doesn't take an academic historian to tell this story. It doesn't take an official to tell this story. There are many ways to enter them and open them up. And again, I could go into all of them. V is somebody I want to introduce you to, too.
Yeah,
Accra, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jean, if you could bring up the first COVID journal, it's Andrea. We're going to go through Occupy. We could go through this also. My first comment to the audience was an invitation to go out into the world and experience it, to compare what you see to what you read about or hear about in the media. And I said that because when I work, these two sisters, this police officer, they're ordinary people. They are out there, well, he's out there because he's working, but they're out there because they decided to make themselves visible. They decided to make themselves public, to speak to, in this case, the idea of civil rights, human rights, of rule of law, the things that we're really focused on today in 2025. But they're ordinary individuals. This idea of making a space for ordinary people, that's all these people are. And what makes them extraordinary, as in with this young man with a skateboard, is that they shared themselves so completely with me, and they feel incredibly present. It's a real honor to receive that from the individuals, but they're not models, they're not actors. You've passed them on the street, undoubtedly. Well, that's Mickey, by the way. He's a postman now, so you may have passed him, especially if you live in Bushwick.
Nam?
Actually, could we go to photos 7 and 8? I guess these photographs were taken at Arodi Point, which is one of the refugee camps on Guam. They called it Tent City. It was right on top of an old Japanese airstrip. The Japanese had occupied Guam during World War II. So, Sean, you had mentioned this idea of putting yourself into history, and I'm going to think back to Accra. You had said something about the frustration you felt with this sort of monolithic view about Occupy Wall Street and the kinds of images that were coming out. And Kristen, I love the idea of inviting the invitation to counter histories. And so for me, all of this work, I think, is being done to raise awareness, to educate, and to inspire. Because my parents were never shy about sharing their stories with me. And not everybody feels the same way, by the way. There are a lot of folks who go through these experiences that undergo extreme forms of trauma, and they never talk about these stories. But my parents were very willing to share, and they felt an obligation, actually, to share with their children, and for us to continue to move those stories forward. So I now feel an obligation to my parents and to my family to talk about this. But my hope is that in doing this kind of work and in having this project, we create a space to inspire others to also come forward and share their stories. So when they see images like this and realize, 120,000 people came through that program. And so a lot of Vietnamese Americans in the diaspora in the United States and in parts of North America today actually have ties to Guam, whether they realize it or not, maybe directly or indirectly. But the more I realize, the more I look into this project and start connecting with people, the more I realize the diverse experiences and stories that people have, the kinds of heirlooms and family artifacts that they have in their possession. We have photographs, we have documents. I don't have a birth certificate because the country I was born in no longer exists. We have old currency from South Vietnam, now completely worthless. But a lot of folks have in their basements or in their attics documents or materials they carried with them as refugees. They made choices to bring things out of their home country, not knowing if they would ever go back, not knowing what the fate of their relatives might be in those places that they evacuated from. But there are stories that are connected to these artifacts. There are stories connected to these heirlooms. And those memories are starting to fade. We are now 50 years after the fact. And so unless people start coming forward, asking those kinds of questions of their relatives or their family members, asking questions about what's in this box, why was this carried out of the old country, those stories are going to disappear. And as an archaeologist, I wish I could go back in time. I wish I had a time machine to go back and interview people and ask them, why did you make this pot? or why did you make this bronze vessel? But I don't have that luxury, but I can see it happening real time. We have the ability to do that right now. And so my hope is that in doing this kind of work, we're empowering people and inspiring them to tell about their stories.
Nam, can you just tell us about one other aspect of this project? And I don't know if you brought it with you, the document that you, or the program that you were showing me beforehand. You may not have it in your, Well, but you can still tell people about it. But this isn't just about material culture or visual culture. It's not only about objects. It's also about rebuilding or creating opportunities for reconnection. There's a piece of this project that is actually about being in Guam, about reconnecting people, yes?
Right, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. I did bring the program, it's in the other room, but we had events on Guam marking the 50th anniversary for these camps that were there. Many of us that went through, and I don't count myself because I was a baby, I don't remember any of this, but many folks that I've interviewed, former refugees, talk about the fact that they left Guam 50 years ago, they'd never been back, and they don't remember very much about that episode because obviously the trauma that they experienced, but also the uncertainty of the life ahead of them. Where were they going to end up? What was the future going to hold for them? And so on. But to be able to go back, many of them came back at this reunion event we had in July to reconnect with the island, to reconnect with the communities there, to find people that were volunteers, that were former military personnel, and to find ways to express their gratitude, their appreciation for this massive humanitarian effort that occurred 50 years ago. There are a couple of images, actually, Gene, if you don't mind showing them. I want to just share very briefly these photos, 10, 11, and 12. 10 in particular, I think, is the one. So yes, my father took photographs aboard the ship that we were on. It's called the USS Kimbrough. It was a naval vessel that was really a transport commercial vessel, then pressed into service to carry refugees. I think the crew could only be typically like 10 to 12 people. That ship ended up carrying about 4,000 people. And we were everywhere on various holds, up and down various decks. My father took some photos of that experience, not only of us being on the ship, but also of this ammunition barge that then ended up docking with our ship and the thousands of refugees that were crossing over. I was doing research trying to find out what happened to the USS Kimbrough, and I came across some photographs online that looked eerily similar to my father's. And then I realized that they were taken by Master Gunnery Sergeant John Irwin of the U.S. Marines. He was in charge of security on that ship. I found out his photos were in a memoir, a biography that he wrote. I found out where he lives, and I contacted him. We then started to share our stories, and we got on a Zoom call. He connected me with some of the other Marines that were under his command. They were running security, trying to safeguard the lives of everybody on that ship for about several weeks. And I recall thanking them for their humanitarian efforts, for helping our families, and so on. And I just remember him breaking down in tears, saying, "Thank you for contacting me. Thank you for showing us that our efforts, our actions meant something, that they resulted in your families surviving and thriving now in the United States." And I wanted to illustrate this as a kind of way to show all of the threads of connectivity. So that event, those set of events in Guam this past summer brought so many folks together. And our hope is that this is just the beginning of this project, that we are going to help inspire others to come forward with their own materials, with their own stories. And I've heard from so many people, because there's an oral history component to this project, about how they had fleeting encounters and conversations with people 50 years ago, but they have never forgotten those folks. They might not have names, they might not know where these folks are, but they've asked me, if there's any way you can help us reconnect with people, we would be very, very fortunate. So that's the project moving forward.
Thank you. I'm gonna kind of continue on this theme, maybe a little bit of the photograph as object, and as object that is maybe misleading in certain ways. And so I'm going to come to you, Accra, because you make those things. But I want to ask it in the context of the moment we're in now, right? So when we look at the screen and we see, I mean, you're extraordinarily, I mean, they're beautiful images, and Nam's dad's images, beautiful, the ones that Kristen shows, but they have a kind of auratic quality, if I can quote the Frankfurt School. They're objects, right? And when they're singled out in this way, when they're separated out from life in this way, they assume a different kind of life. What, in this moment, though, when we are these kinds of images, we can single them out in this way, and they become reified in this way. How do we, in this moment when images are everywhere, we are suffused, right? Our environment is suffused with them. We don't have the luxury, except in moments like this maybe, or in privacy, or looking at a book maybe of photographs, to kind of see them in this way. They're just around us. We're floating in them. They're floating around us. They're being spliced and now by artificial intelligence, right? Not just by advertisers and others and filmmakers, and they're being remixed and faked. What does this do, this moment? What is it doing to the photograph?
You know, that's a huge ongoing concern for everyone, not just image makers, but especially for image makers. I'm going to come back to an idea that I mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about the idea of public memory, that it is something that exists, but we're not sure if it's actually real. And so the veracity of the photograph, take for instance, or as you posited, the singularity of the image, its power to speak to us, to move us. Has it been undone by Instagram? Has it been undone by AI? Well, I don't know if that's possible, because there's part of us that needs to believe, against all available proof, that the photograph is real. All of us desire that the photograph be real. That's what makes AI so upsetting, because we can't put that aside. If we could put it aside, AI would lose all of its malevolence, or most of it, in terms of image making. And I wonder sometimes to myself, well, photography is, what, 175 years old or so? So before 2 centuries ago, before there was photography, did we place our faith in something else? And I imagine, well, we have the expression in English, seeing is believing. And so perhaps the concept is pre-photographic, this idea that we believe in vision to a degree that we just don't have any real proof that it is that real, but we need it to be so. So if we presume from that point, it kind of explains, I'm looking at the audience here, and I know each of them has some photographs that they hold dear. And these photographs are real. They may be people they know. They might be places they visited. It could be a pet. I don't know. Not a fan of cat pictures, just saying. But these photographs stand aside from all the photographs of pancakes at the Pancake House, or the Waldorf salad, or the concoction made by some fancy restaurant whose name I don't know. It's so fascinating to me that people desire to believe in the power of the image. They will not let it go. I don't know what it's connected to. Nam, have you seen anything like that in your area?
And just listening to you talk about this, it starts to bring to mind what forms of documentation existed in the deeper past. And we can talk about rock art and cave paintings from the Ice Ages. We can talk about stela that people erect in different kinds of monumentality. But I think you're right in terms of seeing is believing. People want to believe things. And we can all look at the same kinds of imagery, the same kinds of representations, and come to wildly different interpretations about them. What they're supposed to represent or symbolize, what the function might be. Is the act being done to record something for posterity? Is it meant to be consumed by the masses? Is it meant to be restricted and private? For many archaeologists, we don't know the answer to many of these questions. We can only speculate and test our hypotheses against that material record. But I think it does raise these interesting questions about pre and post photography and AI now. If we cannot believe the authenticity of some of these photographs, I don't think all hope is lost, because it ultimately then falls upon the other sorts of evidence, the other sorts of data that come along with those contexts. And so for many archaeologists, we're always hunting for that. Just because we have an image of something, we can't take it necessarily at face value. And we have to interrogate the rest of the sort of circumstantial evidence, the context. I don't know if that was the nature of your question.
No, you got to it right at the very beginning when you talked about how there are all these ancient forms of image making, and when you talked about cave painting, you made me think about the very first images, which, as I understand it, functioned not just as religious but as almost magic, because,
Yes.
Well, it's easiest to understand if you look at the etymology of the verb or the noun, a spell. Mm-hmm. So like, Harry Potter, gonna put a hex on you, a spell. Well, we also spell words, but words are magical, because when I say apple, it's not just this sound. It's not just a written word. It suddenly becomes a thing in your head. You can even become hungry if I say the right food words. And is that not magic? And the earliest images, which were the first kind of mark making before written language, had that power.
I have some questions here from the audience, but Kristen, I want to bring you in on this part of the conversation before we shift gears.
Yeah, thank you. It's, it's undeniable that this is a moment of big shift in photography, but it's also a medium that has always been in a process of technological transformation. Since its beginning, there have been so many moments where people say this is fundamentally changing photography, and so I think it's in that continuum in some ways. I would also say that the beginning of, trickery with photography didn't begin with AI or even Photoshop, goes back much longer. And it, you could go to the earliest war photographs, and when they're published in a paper, very often the caption that goes with it is not of the event that's shown, right? That they would use a picture of one explosion in one place where they didn't have a picture of, and they would recaption it. And so that goes back to the beginnings of photography. So there's always been this, desire to believe, but also maybe understanding that it represents something, even if it's not technically true. So I think there's another big moment that's happening in photography that we aren't talking about as much as we are talking about AI, which is that there are so many photographic archives being lost. For so many photographers, if you're not a very famous photographer, when you die, where does your material go? And that's true. It's definitely true of analog photographers. I mean, your father's lucky he has you, and you're reactivating his work. That's also part of what Counter Histories is about, is giving work in their other life. But so many press photographers, particularly, the work is just gone. And then with the switch to digital, too, if you haven't kept up migrating your images from one medium to another, I don't want to freak you out, but so there's so many issues about the preservation of history
I just
through
want to give a
photographs.
directive to the audience because what you said is so important. Print your photographs, because what is the cloud but a commercial entity that could be bought, it can be dissolved, it can go bankrupt, and they'll be gone. And you will have no notice, and it's all gone permanently. Print your photographs.
Also, as you said, I was moved by, though we are surrounded by a swarm of photographs all the time, I mean, I could conjure up her name, and I'm sure you can too, the picture, that I have in a frame of me and my mother, or, something very precious, and they are objects too, and that's it's a scan of that is not the same thing. They're objects. They're very, very precious. But that too has long been true of photography, that there have been multiple uses. I mean, that's one of the things that's so fascinating about photography compared to other media is that, art photography has existed alongside science photography and Life magazine and, your yearbook photo. There are many, many uses of photography, and they don't undermine, one doesn't undermine the other. And I think part of what the call to now with Counter Histories and with your work is to slow down and look deeply and spend time with images that have something to offer you, or a different way of accessing a story. So some of it is, and that's also echoed by, you were saying at SVA, the younger photographers coming in, everybody wants to do analog. That there's a desire to slow down, I think.
And I promise I'm going to switch to the questions, but I did want to offer one maybe final comment. If anyone wants to reflect on it, please do. But maybe we're barking up the wrong tree in a way by sort of talking about the documentation of reality or the representation of the real. As you said, Accra, I think photography's been around for 175 years. Before that, people didn't really have a lot of trouble understanding what was real or what was not real, right? We didn't need photos to do that. And I was intrigued by your and Nam's comments about early image making, about the ways in which that might be magic. It might be about seeking favor from the supernatural. It might be it might have been about documentation, but very often it was about feeling and belief. And maybe in some ways, I guess I'm wondering if we're sort of coming full circle back to the start of this, memory isn't about what's real. History isn't, forgive me, Nam, history in many ways isn't about what's real. It's about what we feel or need to be real. I don't know if that resonates with any of you. And if it doesn't, then I'll just switch to the...
It does. It does. I think about the ways in which histories are fabricated, manipulated, and a lot of it sometimes is dependent on consensus, right? It's the moment that we're living in and how we view, what kind of lens we use to interpret. You mentioned a few minutes ago this idea about how we're surrounded by all of these materials and these photographs that are floating out there. One thing that maybe we can share this very briefly. There's image number 4. I was, just like I was doing research on the USS Kimbrough, I was doing research on the USS Midway. And I tried to find out what happened to the ship, what was going on, what archives they have, and I realized that it is retired and it's now a museum off the coast of San Diego. I contacted the library. I talked to the librarian, and he said, I'll get some archival reports to you at some point, but you might want to check out this website that has photographs of the USS Midway's exploits throughout history. And so I went on this website, and I started scrolling through thumbnails, and I came across, after about an hour, one image popped up, and I instantly recognized my father and me in that image. And this is the only photograph of my father during this journey, because he was the image maker. He was never the subject. This was snapped by some random naval photographer who was going through the Midway's hangar. and snapped this photo. If you look at the magazine that it came out of, it just says refugees in the hangar. So we're nameless. We're part of this history, and we can interpret it however we like, and most people looking at this wouldn't even think much about it. But there are stories, obviously, attached to that image. No one would know that my father is not Vietnamese. He wasn't one of the Vietnamese refugees. He's a Korean national who happened to be at that point in time. But I guess the larger message here is, if I came across this by chance, how many more stories, how many more images are floating around out there that are just waiting for us to find? And to the point that we're making about this as well, our interpretations then are very, very important, because it all depends on who's finding these images and for what reason. And there is a certain sort of agency or empowerment if you do come across it, and you can weave it into whatever your purpose or objective might be. There are folks that keep these archives and they have all kinds of access to them, but whether or not you find them for your purposes, I think is altogether a different endeavor.
Let me ask a couple of questions here. I'll throw this one out to anyone who wishes to answer it. So much of history, especially under authoritarian regimes, is what's left out. How do you think artists and activists can responsibly work with these silences without filling them in too neatly at a time when political actors are quite eager to rewrite the past? Anyone?
Well, I mean, I think we have a number of examples of those in the projects that artists have done for Counter Histories, and some of those are looking at state archives, and there's a fabulous one by a photographer named Christopher Gregory Rivera in Puerto Rico, where the U.S. government was spying on Puerto Rican citizens for decades, looking for, independence activity. And there are extensive archives on civilians, and there was a law passed maybe 10 years ago where people could get their file back. There's actually also work from the U.S. in the project that I showed, the same thing, of FBI files, where people could get back their files and see how they had been characterized in state archives. And so I think some of these projects of working with or working against official archives and state archives, trying to mine them for the stories that they unintentionally tell, because also one of the things about authoritarian regimes is oftentimes they're very obsessed with documenting their crimes, and that can be then read against the grain by later generations if they get access to it. So I think there are a lot of ways to sort of read against the original intent of photographic archives, but also to creatively intervene with work that hasn't been photographed. There are so many topics that either weren't photographed or the work has been destroyed, and I think that's where the place of imagination comes in too. And there's some amazing projects. Nona Faustine's work, White Shoes, where she did self-portraits on the sites of either slave markets or other hidden histories that weren't photographed, were pre-photographic, but also weren't photographed, were hidden, and she makes those visible with her body, with photography. Or Dawood Bey's Birmingham series, where there are these double portraits where he has a child the age of one of the children who was killed in the bombings, and it's a double portrait with somebody who's the age they would be now if they had lived. And we think of photography as a medium of the moment or documenting the moment, but that's where imagination and creativity can profoundly help you see or experience something that couldn't be photographed.
And the ability to create, as Nona Faustine and Dawood Bey have done, is not something that you can order up. So the person who contributed the question, it's complicated because you have to wait for the artist to come to that topic. And fortunately for us, there are a lot of artists who are covering a lot of ground. So most everything does get a chance to be looked at, not always seen in public places, but people are really trying to see all the things, even the things that are trying to be covered up and hidden.
Accra, a question for you. How do you deal with documenting protests and the potential legal and extra-legal repercussions for the individuals that you're photographing?
Wow, that's a moving target, actually. So when I started back in 2011 with Occupy, I could actually ask people their names and take information. There's a concept of something called the panopticon. It's based on this idea of a prison guard where in a well-designed prison, one guard can see in all possible directions. So pan meaning all and opticon, seeing everything all at once. And so it's been written that we live in a culture and a society which is rather like a panopticon, where we're under surveillance constantly with the cameras in the streets. Oh, and by the way, in addition to cameras, there are directional microphones recording people talking and sound, and they can tell which direction the sound is coming from. The microphones typically are in the very high traffic areas. The cameras are everywhere. So yes, now in 2025, I don't presume to ask anyone anything. What I do is I offer me. I say, this is who I am. This is my Instagram account. You can photograph it, you can follow me, you can write it down. And if you care to contact me because you want a picture or you want to share something, then you can. And I leave it up, just all up to them, because I can't honestly ask for much more. With the Gaza peace protests, where I was working as a quasi-journalist at that, a photojournalist, I did have to get information. Sometimes the information I promised to keep confidential until this moment, well, if this moment passes successfully and we all are alive, then at some point that information can be known more generally. And other people gave me permission to use it now. There was a piece that was published in the New York Review of Books about 1.5 years ago that the people who agreed to be published were there seen.
My MacDowell colleagues are going to kill me, but I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. Question for Nam. How has this project that you're working on now with the photos and the story of the Guam experience, how has that altered, troubled, or affirmed your relationship to the scholarly discipline of anthropology?
So I guess my simple answer to that is my relationship to the scholarly discipline of anthropology is an evolving one. It evolves as my own interests have evolved, going from the distant past to the more recent past and to the contemporary, but also in lockstep with how the discipline itself has been changing in recent years, not only in terms of anthropology writ large, but also archaeology. And so when we think about the idea of a kind of decolonizing of the discipline, recognizing some of the roots of the discipline, of the disciplines, and how they are tied to colonial endeavors and projects that did cause an inordinate amount of harm for many communities throughout the world. One of the things that I've tried to stay conscious with is in my own work is to involve as many stakeholders and voices and points of view as possible. So this project in Guam, we started these conversations with potential stakeholders a few years ago before I even approached anybody with the project, just to try to find out not only who the players might be, but the different kinds of perspectives that they might have. And so how do we prioritize research objectives? How do we prioritize the kinds of questions we ought to be asking before we even seek support to run these projects and to bring as many of these voices to the table as possible? Now, I'm not going to pretend that we have included every single point of view. It's impossible. But to the extent that we can put the call out there, that's what we've tried to do. It's not an easy relationship, and I think it's, as I mentioned, it's an evolving one. But it is something that I try to stay conscious about.
So last question, and we'll start with Kristen, but everybody should answer this question. What can we do to support this work?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there are many ways. It sort of depends, I guess, on what you mean by that. I mean, some of it is contributing your own stories or finding your own ways of contributing to history or creating archives for the future, documenting, visualizing, hearing other people's stories, making space for other people's stories. So I think that, supporting artists, supporting photographers, supporting people who are telling stories from many, many different perspectives and decentering, what we think of as conventional histories and making space for other histories, wherever you are. I mean, I think that can be done in many spaces, whether it's academia and the arts, in protest, in public space, insisting on a more open and expansive version, back to your idea of public history, and resisting the notion of controlled or unified or official version of history. There are many, many histories.
I was thinking as you were talking about this idea of support, all of you here are supporting the arts, photography, seeing the idea of the archive. You're supporting it now. You're present. You want to know more. To support it further would be to invite someone who is outside the conversation that you know into the conversation, to bring someone to whatever that next thing is that you're going to go see or hear, and bring them and try to get them to go on their own some other time.
I guess I would echo everything that both of you have just said. I would also offer that I think using our tools, our knowledge, and our positions of privilege to bring more and more of these voices and these stakeholders to the table, because there are many folks out there that do not have the sorts of platform to tell their stories, or they might not even know how to even begin experiencing or researching those stories. And so if there are ways in which we can inspire by showing this is the way we document stories or tell our stories or help enfranchise people to tell their stories, to show those examples and to encourage folks to come forward, that's how I would characterize it.
Well, please join me in thanking our three terrific panelists, Accra Shepp, Kristen Lubben, and Nam Kim. Thank you all. And thank you all for being here with us tonight. And please feel free to grab folks after here if you have questions we didn't get to. And did you already announce? All right, you already told everybody. But there will be a reception downstairs also if you want to join us there and continue the conversation. Thanks very much.